All right, guys, let's get to this serious story here. So, Vox has an article about how the Supreme Court is going to decide what cities can do about homeless tent encampments. So, let me walk you through this. An Oregon case will clarify whether officials can jail or fine homeless people for sleeping outside. The Supreme Court announced on Friday it would hear a pivotal case that could transform homelessness policy in the United States. The case is the most significant legal challenge to the rights of homeless people in decades, and how the court rules in a decision expected later this year will shape how cities respond to tent encampments. 4 years ago, the court declined to hear a similar challenge, but since then, the crisis of unsheltered homelessness in America has grown more severe. Municipal backlash to court rulings that have limited cities' response to the crisis has grown more organized, and what to do about people living in tents has become one of the most urgent issues in American politics. The case in question, Grants Pass, Oregon versus Johnson Gloria et al., is a challenge to a 2018 federal class action lawsuit filed by three people who argued that the city of Grants Pass laws and customs illegally punished them for being involuntarily homeless. Attorneys representing the plaintiffs noted the dearth of affordable housing and homeless shelters in the city and blasted Grants Pass arguments that unhoused people could simply leave and go elsewhere. In 2022, a three-judge panel from the Ninth Circuit ruled in favor of the homeless plaintiffs. This wasn't a total surprise. The same appellate court had issued a landmark ruling 4 years earlier that said people without housing can't be punished for sleeping or camping outside on public property if there are no adequate shelter alternatives available. The pivotal decision, Martin versus Boise, has fundamentally shaped cities' response to the homelessness crisis, especially in the 9 western states under the Ninth Circuit's jurisdiction, where some 42% of the country's homeless population now lives. Leaders from dozens of cities and states, both liberal and conservative, have been hoping the U.S. Supreme Court would overturn the Martin and Grants Pass decisions, which they claim were incorrectly decided and leave governments ill-equipped to safely manage their communities. Many groups representing the rights of homeless people, in turn, have said there's no reason for the U.S. Supreme Court to reconsider the rulings, as there's no clear disagreement among circuit courts to resolve. In the half-decade since Martin came down, there have been dozens of cases affirming it, including in the Fourth Circuit in Virginia. Some in the court system, though, have also signaled they'd like to see Martin overruled. Last summer, when the full Ninth Circuit declined to review the Grants Pass decision, 16 judges dissented, arguing both homeless cases were incorrectly decided. Martin handcuffed local jurisdictions as they tried to respond to the homelessness crisis. Grants Pass now places them in a straitjacket, one dissent read. In 2023, an Arizona state judge also urged the Supreme Court to take up the matter, arguing Martin and Grants Pass both tie the hands of the cities that seek in good faith to address the growing homeless encampment epidemic. On Friday afternoon, Ed Johnson, the lead attorney for the homeless plaintiffs, issued a statement defending the Grants Pass decision, describing it as narrow and consistent with decades of Supreme Court precedent. So they go on to say, and this is pretty much the crux of the case here, the Supreme Court will decide if it's a violation of the Eighth Amendment to fine or arrest people experiencing homelessness. So in other words, the Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution bans what's called cruel and unusual punishment, okay? Now, what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment is, of course, debatable, right? And there's different ways you could look at it. You could say, well, what did the founders think was cruel and unusual? Or what do we think today, in the modern day, is cruel and unusual? And, like, for example, I've made the argument that I think the death penalty is cruel and unusual. Most of the countries in the world actually don't have the death penalty anymore. And so it is by definition unusual if fewer places have it. And it's also kind of medieval and barbaric, and it's murdering to say murder is wrong. So that doesn't really make much sense to me. It appears to be a contradiction. So I think state-sanctioned death is kind of cruel and unusual in a criminal justice system. And there was a time briefly, I think in the 1970s, where the Supreme Court agreed with me on that. But since then, it's been overturned, and now we've had the death penalty in the U.S. since then, although some states don't really have it on their state books, or they have it, but they don't enforce it anymore on their state books, and some states have it and do enforce it, right? So, but anyway, I bring that up to say there's debate and disagreement as to what actually constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. So the core of this case is it cruel and unusual punishment to criminalize homelessness? So in other words, if somebody's experiencing homelessness, is it cruel and unusual to bust up their camp and like throw their camp in the dumpster, their tent in the dumpster, steal their pillows and their sleeping bags and confiscate them, have the state confiscate them, basically round them up and throw them in prison, or round them up and throw them on a bus and bring them elsewhere, just out of your hair if you're a particular city that's trying to enforce your laws, whatever they may be, loitering or whatever, charges they bring up vis-a-vis homeless people. So that's the issue in question here. And so far to this point, it looks like courts have generally agreed that if somebody's experiencing homelessness, you can't just criminalize the act of homelessness, right? You can't say, hey, you don't have an apartment that you're renting, or you don't have a house that you own or paying a mortgage on. Therefore, since you're in this like economically destitute position, that by its very nature is illegal, and so we're going to react accordingly. Courts have said that that goes too far, right? That basically people who are homeless are sort of victims by definition, right? Whatever they're struggling with. It, in most cases, just a matter of, I don't have the money. In some cases, it could be mental health issues. In some cases, it could be addiction issues. In some cases, it's all three, right? But the courts have ruled that you can't just criminalize homelessness as such, right? So you can't steal their property, their tent encampments. You can't steal their pillows and their sleeping bags and say, we're just enforcing the law. You can't bust them elsewhere, etc. But my understanding is the argument that's going to be made by the side that wants to allow localities and cities to do this is to say, hey, we have places that you can go. We have like homelessness shelters, and you just don't want to stay in there. So it's not okay for you to basically violate the law and be out in the streets and sleep out in the streets when you have this option. And so to basically try to force you to take that option, we're going to take your tent or take your sleeping bag and your pillow and effectively force you to go over there. Honestly, I think a lot of this is going to hinge on whether or not that's actually true, right? Because courts previously have ruled, yeah, you say they have places to go. They don't really have places to go. Or the places that they go are not adequate, right? The places that they go are cockroach infested and overcrowded and not fully funded and bad, et cetera, right? So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I mean, my take on it is I generally agree with courts that say it is a violation of cruel and unusual punishment to say just being homeless by its very nature is going to be criminalized, right? You shouldn't be locked up behind bars or have all of your stuff stolen because you're economically destitute and you can't afford to rent a place, right? Or you can't afford to put a roof over your head. I think that is cruel and unusual. That's the first point. But the second point is, I think it actually does make sense. See, the problem here, people put the cart before the horse here, right? So if you pass a law, either federally or state by state or city by city, that says you have a right to a roof over your head, right? And assuming that these sorts of things, whether they be mini homes or an apartment complex or whatever, that you have a right to have that roof over your head and it's fully funded and that's true, in that scenario, I wouldn't have a problem with taking somebody who is homeless and just moving them to the place where they have the roof over their head, right? But the fact of the matter is that's not where we are, right? So it should be the situation where at the federal level or a state-by-state level or a city-by-city level, we actually fund the initiative to have a roof over people's heads, which, by the way, in the long run, would save money. It actually saves money to taxpayers if you do that. There's been a number of studies on this. It costs more money to the taxpayers if you don't have like a universal housing policy approach. So in a scenario where everybody did have a roof over their head as a matter of right, as a matter of law, in that scenario, I would have no problem saying, sorry, you can't be out here, but you can be in this place which is yours, which is a roof over your head. But the fact of the matter is we don't live in that place, right? And so the unfortunate reality is courts have ruled, yeah, they have a right to be in this horrible situation that they're in, right? And I think the thing that frustrates me the most is, look, I understand why normies and apolitical people and everybody would look at a homeless encampment or, see very brazen displays of poverty and degradation, and they'd be like, I don't want this here, right? I understand why somebody would say that. But what we have to understand is it doesn't actually fix the problem to just criminalize, right? Because in that scenario, what happens? Okay, you're just arresting homeless people for being homeless. Well, as we already established, that's unconstitutional and illegal and totally immoral, right? So you can't just lock them up. You can't just steal their shit, because that's stealing. And you can't just put them on a bus and send them elsewhere, because you're just, shifting the deck chairs around on the Titanic, saying, hey, we just don't want this to be our problem anymore. We're going to make it your problem, city next door, which might solve the immediate problem for people in a particular city, but that's not actually objectively solving the problem. The problem still exists. It's just not in front of your eyes anymore, right? So I understand where people would come from where they'd want, like, let's criminalize homelessness. But again, you're putting the cart before the horse. You can only, quote unquote, criminalize homelessness when the situation on the ground objectively is the case that everybody does have a roof over their head and it's okay. And in that scenario, if somebody's a hardcore addict, yeah, in some instances, an involuntary hold to try to help them with their addiction makes sense. If somebody has deep mental illness, paranoid schizophrenia, or whatever it may be, severe bipolar disorder, you name it. In that scenario, in some instances, sure, an involuntary hold to try to get them on their medicine and get the situation corrected, I think makes sense. But in most situations, as we've discussed, it really is just a money issue. It's really just down on my luck type issue. And in a scenario like that, you can't criminalize it first. You have to provide the roof over the head. And then in that scenario, you could say, no, you're not really allowed to be out here, do this or do that. It's violating other laws. And by the way, here's a place for you, right? Here's a place. If you're not saying here's a place for you, if there's not actually a decent place for you that is livable, then effectively there's not much you can do. There's not much you could do. Now, what's my guess? This might be a bold prediction. I'm going out on a limb here when I say it. But my guess is the Supreme Court is going to put the cart before the horse, and they are going to say, no, you're allowed to just criminalize homelessness. And then in that scenario, what you'll see is there will be plenty of people who will think, like Republicans will think, and many normie apolitical people will think, oh, look, now the cities are fixing the homelessness problem. They are not. They're locking them up in jail or prison or just shifting them somewhere else where they're out of their own hair. And yeah, the tent encampment might not be there, but you still have over 400,000 Americans who are experiencing homelessness. It's just not in front of your face anymore, right? So I fear that they are going to make that decision. I fear that they are going to say it is not a violation of the Eighth Amendment to criminalize homelessness, even though I think it pretty clearly is that. I think they're going to say it's not that. So there you have it. This will be a big deal. And courts, the precedent previously has been very clear. I think the Supreme Court will override that precedent. We'll see whether or not I'm right.
Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.